Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is one in a million. He is a gentleman, a scholar, an author, a star, and, well, let's put it this way. We don't have enough time allotted to this interview. Just to do the introduction properly would take up the whole time. But as the young people say, George Stevens Jr. has not only been there and done that, he probably wrote the script, produced, directed, and won an award for it, too. So in these few introductory remarks, we can only touch on the barest outline of his achievements. This is a man who made his acting debut in an R-gang comedy at the age of 16 months. A man who was, as a 6-year-old, rescued from drowning in a neighborhood pool by Olympic swimmer and Tarzan star Johnny Weissmuller, who was a recent college graduate, takes Elizabeth Taylor to dinner, a man who has worked directly with 7 U.S. presidents, who has had to push aside the 15 Emmys on his shelf to make room for an Oscar for Lifetime Achievement, a man who was the founding director of the American Film Institute, a man who co-founded, wrote, and produced the Kennedy Center Honors for 37 years, a man who has more than 5,000 items of his television work in the Library of Congress, including those 37 Kennedy Center Honors, 32 Christmas in Washington shows, American Millennium, and We Are One, the Obama inaugural concert. Not content to rest on his laurels, is also a man who drew on his insider knowledge of both show business and politics to write a rich and absorbing book titled My Place in the Sun, subtitled Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington. The book was published last May to great success and acclaim, and now there's an audiobook version available. We are delighted about that because it gives us a good excuse to meet with the author. We're very pleased to welcome George Stevens Jr.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, I made my acting debut. That was also drew the curtain down on my acting career.
But you've been around show business, and the old debate about which is the greatest influence, nature or nurture, is kind of moot in your case because you're surrounded by both as a fourth generation involvement in show business and also growing up in and around Hollywood, starting with people in your family back to your great grandparents' generations. And it's wonderful to hear about all this in the book.
Oh, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed the response to the book because I didn't know quite what I was going into when I wrote it, but now that I talk to people and look back on it, I realize that a great part of it, the strength of the book, is that the extraordinary people that I've worked with and known in my life, and the opportunity not only to tell my story, but to in part tell their stories.
And I think so many wonderful tidbits about it. I'm just going to quote a few of them because if people have not yet read it, they really, really need to, and listen to it as well now. But your great grandmother starred on stage with Edwin Booth, Ophelia to his Hamlet in San Francisco. Now, people today may not be so familiar with the name Edwin Booth, but he was the star in the late 1800s in theater when it was all theater. And unfortunately, he was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, and drew a lot of stigma from that. But that's a pretty amazing way to be on stage. And I love the fact that you're sharing that with us.
Well, yeah, and that is, and she was the mother of my father's mother, Georgie Cooper, who became a wonderful actress in the theater in San Francisco, and married a man called Lander Stevens, who was the actor manager of the theaters that they played in. And so then that generation, and on the other side of that generation, my mother's mother, Alice Howell, came to Los Angeles from vaudeville in New York and was in the first 5 films that Charlie Chaplin directed, and went on to be a star in her own right of her own silent films. So yes, I've had a lot of good surroundings, let's call it.
All right, and I have to of course mention your father, George Stevens Sr., who directed. I started as a cameraman, cinematographer, later became a director and directed 60 films, including Academy Awards for Giant and A Place in the Sun, and also directed Shane, Diary of Anne Frank, and Gunga Din. How much fun was it growing up with this in this situation?
Well, it was wonderful. I mean, my father, uh, he had a great sense of humor. That's what first attracted my mother. She had dinner with him with with Oliver Hardy, who was a friend of her mother's, and she said this. He was Laurel and Hardy's cameraman. He was 27 or 8 years old, and she said George kept saying the funniest things. He kept topping these other comedians, and I said, where did he? Anyway, he had great humor, and lots of other qualities, which we may end up discussing. But but he went away to war when I was 11 and was gone for 3 years. And he, at age 37, too old for the draft, and making Penny Serenade, the talk of the town, the more the merrier, woman of the year, all in that order. Decided he couldn't stay in Hollywood while this war was going on, and asked for a combat assignment. And General Eisenhower made him head of, asked him to form a special coverage unit to film the Normandy landings and the war in Europe. And he went across Europe in a Jeep called the Toluca, named after Toluca Lake, where we lived in North Hollywood. And from D-Day to the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, while I was going to the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th or 9th grades.
And I think one of the things that really impressed me, I mean, those of us in my generation, which are the baby boomers post World War II, always thought of World War II as being in black and white, because that's all we saw. And was so amazing to discover that your father had taken a bunch of color film with him, and 40 some years later, you put together a wonderful documentary about that.
Yes, I mean, it was, they shot 35 millimeter black and white film that then they'd pack up and ship to the United States, and it would be cut into the newsreels, and we would go to the theaters, and along with the feature film we'd see, there'd be newsreels, and we'd see about the war. But he also had his 16 millimeter camera that he took behind the scenes film of on Gunga Din, and they had this 16 millimeter film that they carried around, and they shot their own color home movie of the war, as it were.
And it was really, really surprising to see that. Of course, that's the way it was lived in real life in color. But not only did
I should mention that, and I used that in 2 films. One called George Stevens, A Filmmaker's Journey, which is the feature-length documentary that I made about my father, interviewing Katharine Hepburn and Fred Astaire and Joel McCrea and all the actors, Elizabeth Taylor. And the other was called George Stevens, or is called, because they're both available on the Criterion Channel and HBO Max, called George Stevens called George Stevens D-Day to Berlin. That's the story of this special coverage unit that became known as the Stevens Irregulars.
And that was just where I was going to go with that, because I had the great delight of watching both of them and discovering that your father had a wonderful voice, and you have a really smooth voice as well. So that leads me to transition a little bit into the fact that this is now available as an audiobook. And I have to ask, how long did it take you to do that?
It's a lot of work. It's it was several weeks of recording. I think over 50 hours of recording, and because in my film work I'm used to attention to detail I learned from my father, and making sure things are right. But I had a wonderful editor who was remote in Nashville named Mark Gallup. And Mark and I worked so hard on the editing and refining to make it as good as we could make it.
Well, it both cases it was I'm sure that if it's as really as good, I haven't yet done that, but that's my next stop. And when you're going through reading your own words, did you ever think, maybe I should change the emphasis on this, or did you do it two or three times and pick the one you like the best?
Well, what pleased me most was really the first time I'd had to really concentrate page by page and read the book after abandoning it, giving it over to the publisher. We say we don't finish things, we eventually abandon them. And I was so pleased that I didn't really want to change much, but I did find certain places where to capture the meaning, you needed to rephrase it. So, but it was a pleasure, having, again, the control to do it and make it the way I wanted it to be.
Well, I will tell you, as a longtime old radio announcer, I was absolutely impressed with your smooth delivery on the documentaries. Weird stuff. I'm going to bounce all over the place. The title, My Place in the Sun, does that have a subtle meaning about perhaps being out of the shadow of your famous father?
I think it can be interpreted that way. You're never that specific. Actually, a friend suggested, Pat McGilligan, a wonderful writer in Wisconsin, suggested that title. And we've been looking and looking and looking, and it seemed just right because, it is it is My Place in the Sun. And of course, it's a play on my father's wonderful film, A Place in the Sun.
It really resonates. I think I love a title that has multiple meanings. So I have to ask a couple of oddball questions. One was, how much fun was it to take Elizabeth Taylor to dinner?
Oh my God. Well, I was a little nervous because I guess I was 21 or 22. She was married, and I thought she'd invited me to dinner at her house, and I drove over and I parked in the thing wondering who I was going to see, and I ring the doorbell and kind of two little children run by, and then this vision kind of walks into eyesight in a blue dress, and we greet one another, and I'm looking around to see who else is there, and she said, where are we going? And suddenly I realized I was taking Elizabeth Taylor out to dinner, and I was sort of stuck for an answer. I wasn't a man about town yet, with a lot of restaurants and maitre d's names. So I said, well, Trader's is off, Trader Vic's. I said, that's off nice, isn't it? And she said, yes, that's fine. And so I went to a phone, and 411 or whatever it was in those days, got the number for Trader Vic's and called and asked if they would have a table for two in 20 minutes. And they said, yes, we can. I said, my name is Stevens. And the fellow said, okay. And then we drove over there. And as I got out of the car, we got out of the car and walked into the restaurant. I was concerned, here I'm bringing the most beautiful woman in the world, and I hope the guy didn't have a bad table for two somewhere. But as we walked up, the man looked at her and he looked at me and he said, well, good evening, Mr. Stevens. And I guess he made the connection between my father's name and Elizabeth Taylor. And we had this wonderful table with is a Polynesian restaurant with two big chairs with fans. Anyway, it was delightful. Indeed, a memorable experience.
I want to switch now and mention the fact that I was kind of intrigued that your first directing job came from Jack Webb, the Dragnet man himself.
Yeah, well, I was an admirer of Jack's, and he was acquainted with my father. And I guess I'd met him a couple of times when I was in the Air Force. And when I got out of the Air Force, I got a nice letter from him. I was in the hospital in the Air Force with hepatitis. And I found this letter because I remembered receiving it. And he wrote me kind of a funny letter wishing me well. And so when I came back and was looking for a job, I called and had an interview with Jack, and he hired me as an assistant. And then when I was about 25, he gave me my first directing assignment on a series he was doing. So he was very influential in my life.
Indeed. And then you ended up working with Peter Gunn and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Got to meet the master himself.
I did. But although less than, I said hello to him then. He had a very talented woman called Joan Harrison, an English woman, who was running the television series while he was making his movies. But I got to know him much better during my AFI period of running the American Film Institute.
Well, let me go right to that at this point, because it just seems to kind of flow that, and that is the fact that this was your idea. And I'm wondering if part of it was the fact that your ancestress, who was in the early silent films, many of those had already been gone because of the nitrate film stock.
Well, it was, but we have to kind of make a little jump here.
Yeah.
I was living that life in Hollywood, directing television and working with my father on The Diary of Anne Frank as his associate producer, and I directed the location scenes in Amsterdam. And so I had become like his partner, and we were about to do The Greatest Story Ever Told together. And Edward R. Murrow came into my life, the great broadcaster who President Kennedy had been elected, and he had appointed Murrow to run the United States Information Agency that told America's story abroad. It had the Voice of America for radio, and they made films and other. And Murrow asked me to come to Washington at age 29 and run the motion picture division of USIA. Well, first I told him I couldn't because I was working with my father, though I was overwhelmed, not overwhelmed, but so impressed to meet Murrow and have a conversation with him. And my father, before long, told me that I should think seriously about going with Murrow. And I did. And of course, it was a life-changing experience because it brought me into the new frontier and the President Kennedy's world. And during that, President Kennedy appointed the first National Arts Council. There had never been any federal support for the arts. And Kennedy was eloquent about the importance of the arts. And they created the National Endowment for the Arts shortly after the president's death. And they knew what to do with symphony orchestras, grants to ballets. They did not know what to do about film. And so they came to me. I was a film guy in Washington working at USIA. And I suggested an American Film Institute. And they asked me to run it. And I did for a while. 12 years.
And as I understand, it's now up to saving something in the neighborhood of 40,000 films that would have otherwise gone away and been lost to our history.
That's been true. At the time, this fragile nitrate-based stock, film stock, it deteriorated. It could catch fire, and and the people who made films in those days, it was one and done. They didn't think there was any future for them. And so the AFI, working with George Eastman House and the Museum of Modern Art and the Library of Congress, we worked together to create this. There are, I think it's 40,000 films in the AFI collection in the Library of Congress, that most of which would have been lost had it not been for this joint archival effort.
It's just amazing things that have been found, and they keep coming up with them. Sometimes my understanding is they've even found copies overseas in other countries.
John Ford, the great director, his first film was called Straight Shooting, and it was among the missing films. Films used to travel around the world, and Straight Shooting was found in the Czech archive with Czech subtitles.
That's so nice. So amazing. I think of John Ford, all those Westerns. Oh my gosh. And working with all those people. I also have to ask, the Kennedy Center honors is an interesting story in itself as well.
Well, and again, it comes back to President Kennedy. I was running the AFI. We always had to be raising money. And for our 10th anniversary in 1977, we did an event. And I was able to enlist Jimmy Carter to host a White House reception. And then we did a performance in the Kennedy Center Opera House about America's greatest movies with all sorts of stars and directors. And the Kennedy Center was on CBS and very important for AFI. And the next day I went to see the head of the Kennedy Center to thank him and also to say, you should have your own event here that's televised. And he said, do you have any ideas? And I said, the idea is carved in marble on your wall outside. And he said, the Kennedy Center is the memorial to John F. Kennedy. And his words are carved in marble. And among them were, I look forward to an America that will not be afraid of grace and beauty, that will reward achievement in the arts the way we reward achievement in business and statecraft. So this idea of honoring the arts was, in a sense, President Kennedy's idea. And we, again, enlisted Jimmy Carter to have a White House reception. I sold it to CBS as a 2-hour special. And it became what it is. The first honorees in that year were Arthur Rubinstein, George Balanchine, Richard Rogers of Rogers and Hammerstein, Marian Anderson, the great contralto soprano, black soprano, and Fred Astaire.
And every year it's a magnificent lineup. And I will have to tell you, as a personal, I don't know how many times I have watched the Led Zeppelin Kennedy Center honors with that amazing, with the Wilsons and the giant chorus and John Bonham's son playing the drum. I mean, it's an emotional moment, and you did a beautiful job in putting that together.
Oh, I did. My son Michael was was great with that era of music. And, you know, and I looked at it just the other day, showed it to some friends, and just the way it builds and the way that the three guys, the Zeppelin guys, you know, just their appreciation for it. And they told us they were so tired of hearing that song because people were always, they just never quite pleased them. And they absolutely said it revived their love in that song.
Oh, that is great to hear about that.
You can find it on YouTube.
Yes, and I highly recommend it. I mean, if you haven't seen it before and you are any kind of rock and roll fan, or even just a fan of really, really good music, you should check that out.
Because part of the wonderful cutting is that, again, Michael edited it, but Yo-Yo Ma, just, you know, his joy listening to it. And you were wondering how Yo-Yo was hearing this with such bliss, you know.
Yeah. But well, he is known for being involved with more beyond classical music and doing concerts with people from other genres, and but always with joy. I think that's one of the things people like about him so much. And you mentioned your son, and I just want to acknowledge the sad loss of him and the fact that you dedicated this book to your father and your son, and only could wish what might have been. Yeah. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Michael Stevens is a great citizen.
And a talented author as well, an auteur, as it were. You have enjoyed a life in Washington, D.C. to the point where you invite the president for dinner and he comes. What fun must that have been?
Well, it was great fun. And we had a guest, actually Charlton Heston was coming to Washington to do the Caine Mutiny court martial. And I just had this idea one evening in my office. Actually, I was in my office, which was in the Kennedy Center, above the Eisenhower Theater, where Heston was playing. And I looked out my door, that a glass office, right? And I saw a Secret Service man outside my door. And he said, Mr. Stevens, what time will you be leaving? And I said, I'll go in about 20 minutes. And I say, may I ask why? And he said, well, President Reagan is coming to see Heston in the thing and the K Mutiny. And kind of, I just picked up the phone and dialed Linda Faulkner, who was Nancy Reagan's very talented press secretary, social secretary. And I said, Charlton Heston's in town. It just occurred to me, did the President and Mrs. Reagan ever go out for dinner? She said, well, yes, they were at the British Embassy just last week. And all of a sudden I felt so foolish. I was here and I said, well, if Charlton Heston's in town, and I thought that if they, well, I'll be happy to pass that on, and I just hung up and I said, oh, what a jerk I was. And Liz and I, my wife, were Democrats. And I went home and I didn't mention it to Liz. It was just too embarrassing that I'd done this. And the next morning, Liz is going out, and I wanted to talk to her about our son David's school. And she said, well, I've got a meeting of the Women's Campaign Fund, this group. And I said, okay. Next thing I know, the phone rings, and a secretary says, I have Mr. Jack Courtemanche on the phone. And that was Mrs. Reagan's chief of staff, who I didn't know. And now I'm feeling really stupid. And he says, Mr. Stevens, did you invite the Reagans for dinner? And I said, well, I was just, and I started kind of apologizing. And he said, they were wondering, would next Monday night work? And so now I said, well, I better check with my wife.
Right answer. Absolutely.
So then I had to call Liz and tell her that the Reagans were coming for dinner without her knowing that I'd invited them. But anyway, they came, and it was a wonderful thing in Washington in those days that across the ocean sort of politics existed, and we had a actually wonderful time.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, they didn't say how many people to have or anything. We have a tennis court. I could have put a tent over the tennis court and invited 400 people. Liz, being a wonderful, sensitive, bright person, said, they're always at dinners where they're seated at different tables. Why don't we just have one table of 10?
It's very thoughtful. Absolutely. And then you have to figure out which of your friends would love to do that and which would be upset that you didn't invite them. So it gets tricky socially sometimes.
Yeah, well, okay, quickly. So we had Liz and I and the Reagans and the Hestons, that's 6. Andy Williams was going to be doing a concert at Wolf Trap the next night, so we knew he was going to be in town. So we invited Andy. Nicole Salinger, the wife of President Kennedy's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, was coming to visit us. So then we only had 2 more places, and we invited John Guare, the great playwright, and Adele Chatfield Taylor. And so when the Reagans came in, Guare had never met Reagan, and they were on the porch, and we escorted the Reagans out to the porch. And he was introduced to John Guare. No, he walked out and he looked at John Guare and he said, 4 Tonys, that's so great. And John's play, The House of Blue Leaves, had won Tonys the night before. So it was Democrats and, it was just a very nice gathering.
Indeed. I'm curious, in going through all of your memories, all of the wonderful things about the past, about your family, and you get down to the book, and at some point you have to edit it down. Was there a story that you really wanted to put in but just didn't quite work that you could share with us?
I think I told the stories that belong in the book, and it would be hard for me to think of which one I might not included. But having I'll tell you a story about my father. We were editing Giant, Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean. And I had been in the Air Force. I'd worked with him on the script, gone in the Air Force for 2 years, and I was now out of the Air Force working with him on the editing. And he'd been editing for over a year. And it ended up being a 3-hour and 20-minute film, which we previewed the restoration of it at the Turner Classic Movies Festival a year ago, Steven Spielberg, who had been involved in the urged the restoration, and I introduced it. And here's a picture made 65 years earlier that premiered in that theater. And we showed it on the IMAX screen.
Oh boy.
And to see a 65-year-old film play like that. But I'm ahead of the story because we were editing it, and I was in my early 20s, and long days and hot. And I said to Dad at one time, we previewed it twice, and he kept going from the beginning, refining. And I said, Dad, this picture, we've shown it twice. Don't you think you should just get it out there? And he stopped and he said, you think about how many man hours, he would have said man and woman hours today, how many man hours are going to be spent watching this film over the years, 3 hours at a time. He said, don't you think it's worth a little more of our time to make it as good as we can in the interest of those people who are going to be spending their time? And, it's an idea that just stuck with me in everything I've done. And I said, in editing this book, I had the opportunity during COVID just to go through it and trim it and refine it. So it really has become kind of, I think it's a better book than it would have been if I hadn't had COVID, if COVID hadn't come.
Well, it may be something to think about that then. I appreciate that, because I will have to say, as an author, a person who's interviewed more than 800 authors, this is one of the finest books I have ever read. It will keep you page turning. I read it in 2 sessions, and it'd be one, except I had to fall asleep sometime. So I highly recommend it. So here's the two wrap up questions. One, when they make the movie, who do you want them to play you?
Well, I think Redford's a little old.
I do indeed, but it would be logical for you. I just want to thank you as a consumer and as somebody who's an American for all that you and your family have done, and want to highly recommend the book to anybody and all. This is one of the good ones. This is one you will cherish and go back to again and again. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up today?
Well, it's just so nice talking with you. And I guess the final thought would be the other great thing I learned from my father, and I think would interest you as a host. When people say, what's the most important thing you learned from him? It's respect for the audience. He was always wanted to trust the audience. The studios in those days used to say the audience has the mentality of 14 years old. He has the mentality of 14-year-olds. But he always, he understood that the audience brought something to the film, that they had ideas and questions. And so just as a final little tip of the hat to our audience.
I appreciate that so much. And our audience will indeed. Our guest today has been George Stevens Jr. His book is My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington, and now available, narrated by the author himself as an audio book. Check it out as soon as you can. Thanks so much for your gracious time with us today.
Enjoyed it. Thank you so.